So with me, let me introduce Harold, Madi. Harold is an award-winning planner and architect with over 25 years of experience gained in the private and public sector. He is founding principal of Urbanism by Design, UXD, the former director of urban design for the City of Toronto, and has held senior positions in a number of prominent Toronto-based firms, leading large-scale, multifaceted, and visionary projects across Canada and abroad. Harold also is the Canadian contributor for Suburban Remix, creating next generation of urban places. So I think you'll be able to speak to a lot of that today too. Harold also, we're very fortunate to have Harold as a member of the city's urban design review panel. And I've been there many times. I've always found that your contribution has been very, very insightful. Yeah, vocal too, yes. So we're going to, I guess the way it's going to work today is I have some questions for Harold, but we want to have some time for any of you who might wish to either make a comment or have a question to pose that as well. So Ruth is going to monitor our time so that we are not too vocal, I guess. So let's start it off. Harold, knowing Mississauga as you do, what do you think the most significant thing for us is to learn from the film we just saw?
Yeah. I should also add that I grew up in Mississauga. This is my hometown. So not only am I've worked here and I continue to work here, but it's also the place that I know very well because I went to school here, elementary and high school, and until I moved away for college, this was my home, and I continue to come back for many different reasons. So I know the city well, and I was a very keen observer at the time growing up because I didn't know exactly what it was that I wanted to do, but I was very much interested in change in the cities and watching Mississauga at that time growing. I was here from the time that it was basically incorporated in '74 onwards. So, I watched Square One very closely for many years, and the lack of change there bothered me so much. Here we are today, and it's a very different time. So just to answer that question, one of the things that struck me, and I'm going to respond very specifically to the film because that's what we've just watched, and I think that some of the things, the takeaways for me have been, with respect to Mississauga, number one, that though things may seem to work well right now, the future does not bode well for this place. I mean, I don't know if you were able to understand the implications of the way we have built the city and the future, that there isn't one. And unless we change, like other places around the globe are, very quickly, that we risk. We have great risks ahead of us. So those risks are economic. Those risks are blight, and I mean, they talked about how the periphery of the city, the suburban areas that were once the place where people wanted to go, this is a place of success and health, are in fact going to be the potential slums of the future. So how do we turn that around, and how do we take some of that information, knowing that, this isn't going to function economically. Our tax, we can only raise property tax to a certain degree before it's a breaking point, because to actually function, you need to, at this level of density, for example, it costs a lot. You pay a lot more on your tax rates than we do in the city of Toronto, for example. I think almost twice as much as what we pay in Cabbagetown. And that's because it costs a lot of money to actually run a city at a very low density. So we have to think about some of those important takeaways in terms of implications of this pattern, and how do we alter that pattern in such a way that not only do we work better, but we also continue to accommodate growth, because for cities to succeed, they need to continue to change and to grow. And the other takeaways was that metrics matter. Measuring change and understanding that it's not just about an opinion, this is about evidence. It's about actual demonstrated change that has numbers and implications, and being able to collect that data and to play it back and say, look, this is what has happened because of our efforts here. It becomes a very compelling communication tool. The other thing that I took away from this is that, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a little bit messy. Cities are a little bit messy, but you know what? I looked at those earlier images in China where, you saw the contrast between that bleak environment of car-dominated highways and streets the new progressive China versus the old one. And I don't know if you felt the same way I did, but I felt kind of nostalgic feeling. Sure, the music helps. But if you noted the background music, it kind of told you how you should be feeling. But nevertheless, I think the visuals were very strong. That old China, the one in which was walkable, the one that had a mix of uses, that vibrancy, that sense of community, is true. It's a true thing. And versus the one that in which isolation and health issues are a result of the fact that we've segregated everything is a problem. So, so I think that the messiness of a city isn't something we should fear. That there's something great that comes out of that place. And I bet you any money, the places that you visit most are pretty messy cities, according to what planners think is messy and not messy. And the other thing the last one I'm going to say is that though these things take time to change, they're viral. They seem to, once the evidence is established and once the change begins, it almost exponentially becomes real, and that the change takes hold and it becomes easier with time. So it's always hard to make that first initial decision to make a change happen, but once it's in place and it's demonstrated success, it becomes a lot easier to implement elsewhere.
Yeah, we saw that in Times Square, I guess, as an example. So you said that you were raised here in Mississauga, so you've seen its transformation. Mm-hmm. We are in our planning process now forecasting probably almost 1 million people by 2041, and there's a growth plan that directs growth to the city that we have to accommodate. So maybe speak to us on your experience, both living in Mississauga and now working in Mississauga and providing advisory on urban growth. Some of the examples that you feel are actually working from a human-centric perspective, and maybe some opportunities we might have.
Okay, this is an interesting question, and I think Mississauga has some really great aspects to it that we can't deny. Mississauga benefited as one of the first real significant developed urban areas outside of the city of Toronto as a suburban municipality. So it got to benefit from the large land holdings that enabled what we call complete community, a comprehensive community design. So, for example, Earn Mills, Meadowvale, they were kind of modeled similarly to what was Don Mills, kind of traditional, original contemporary suburban development. So they were completely master planned with schools, parks, the road system. Everything was coherent. Though we know today that they're not ideal in terms of their ability to change and evolve and to accommodate the changing demographics and all the things that we want cities to do, but the important thing to know is that they're the least of the bad. So Mississauga benefited from having significant, comprehensively planned suburban developments, and then everything else that was left over. And so outside, of course, of everything south of the QEW, which was there pre-74, a lot of the new significant built-out areas are comprised of these fully planned communities, which function relatively okay, and what we call suburban sprawl. So it's kind of the lesser, smaller land holdings that kind of were weaved together and don't really make a lot of sense. So when you look at the city today and you try to think about the things that we should be celebrating that might demonstrate really good stuff that we can build on, that's not going to be imported but is kind of homegrown, you kind of have to, and I know this might be a bit of a cliche, you kind of look at the past a little bit. And I think about Streetsville, and I think about this as a young person in Mississauga. I went to the Rainbow Festival. Does that even exist anymore? In Port Credit. So there was festivals. There was the other one in Streetsville. It was the Honey something or another. Okay, yes. So as a kid, I'd ride my bike all the way from Dixie and Bloor to Street. I mean, this is how much of a committed Mississaugan I was. I'd go all the way to Streetsville. I was a really geeky teenager who really wanted to think about city building at a very early age. But I would go to Streetsville, and I was amazed by these places because they were built walkable. They were walkable places. They predated the automobile, the advent of the automobile. And if you look at the fabric of those places, Port Credit has really spectacular, perfect grid of streets, which is entirely walkable. Those are really important models that we should be looking at. And when you look at today's contemporary developments to celebrate Mississauga, I would say those that built off of those and took their those existing ingredients and extended them and built on them are really ones that I would say are worth celebrating. So, for example, in Port Credit, the East Village, I think they call it that area that was the St. Lawrence Mills or grain starch. Thank you, St. Lawrence starch site done by Fran Group, which was I understand a bit of the history here. It was opposed by the local residents. And does everybody know which development we're talking about? Straight down the end of Highway 10 or here in Ontario, you land in this little infill development that was done in the 90s that was fought by the residents. And in the end, I think most would agree that it's a pretty successful example of what the future might be in terms of infill and redevelopment that's more dense, that has a bigger mix of uses, that is built on the walkable scenario, but and has done very, very well. Not only has it not detracted, but in fact enhanced the quality of Port Credit, it has also brought in a greater number of people into the area, and it also has created an environment that that is very pedestrian friendly. So it's a good model as an example to celebrate. Now, the other one I want to point to, which is very local here, is the retrofitting going on around Square One. So, for example, Sheridan College, what an incredible injection into the downtown area to have a college or an academic setting. And it's not one of those campus settings that has got a sea of parking around it, but it's actually a very urban model. So not only is that model really great, and it's done at a fine grade, but then I looked at what was done on Duke of York, so which was a 4-lane busy street, and it still is in some certain sections, but what a great thing that was done in conjunction with the college is they took and put a roundabout, that's a very walkable roundabout, not the bad ones, and the street is down to 1 lane essentially in each direction, and it's become a walkable, friendly, campus-enhancing or complementary environment. It's a small little injection or a small little piece of a bigger puzzle that I think if you look at the rest of the downtown Mississauga area, that should be a real precursor to what we need to be doing on all of the streets, that they need to become far less fast-moving and far more pedestrian-friendly. Just as examples to, I think, build on.
No, those are great. I actually agree with you there. And one of my other favorite areas in Mississauga is Cooksville. I've always found that really, it's messy, like you say, but it's actually fascinating, one of my favorites. So driving change that we talked about takes effort, and sometimes it can be difficult and it can be challenging. What do you think the strategy for driving change, or the most important strategy for driving change? Is it the policies? Is it the market conditions? Is it the people? Or maybe it's the politicians, or all of the above, maybe?
Yeah. Okay, so I think a lot of the answer to that really has to lie in understanding where the resistance is. So Mississauga is in an unfortunate position right now because we're kind of at a convergence of kind of a perfect storm, if you want to call it that, which is that you have the economics that suggest that we have a better way of doing things that is going to cost taxpayers less money, and it's going to be more profitable potentially in terms of job growth, which is a more walkable pattern. And then you have the policies, some of it that was forced down on us from the previous provincial government and through a growth plan. We have a regional plan in Ontario, which is really unique. Not all city regions have growth plans, okay, where it's actually by law forced on the municipalities, suburban ones included, what density you have to be achieving, and it needs to be a sustainable one. It needs to be one that is actually going to create, if done correctly, going to create more livable, more environmentally sustainable environments that are in fact by law. So the city of Mississauga has to, through its official plan process, meet targets that are being set by the province through a regional plan that is a coherent, comprehensive look at the way the region needs to change, which links into transportation and all the other things that make areas function. So it's a good thing because if we were all planning our little cities in the GTA according to our own kind of blinders on and not really thinking about how we connect to the larger region, it's destined to fail. So it's an important point to keep to make. So I think that the things that we need to think about in terms of making change happen at the municipal level is that if you're already given targets, it makes it a lot easier to achieve higher density in the city because we're forced to. So you're being forced to do it. So now the question is, how do we do it well? And I think a lot of the focus has to be in the conversations ahead, and when you look at your official plan, on what kind of city that we want to be. And I think there needs to be a broader conversation that talks about, and is also very honest about what the implications are. The implications even of what we know to be a better model is going to take some time, and it's going to be a bit of rough riding to get there. And there's going to be some changes in behavior that have to happen, which we always know happen. So there's an incredible resistance, but then but it's a kind of short-term awkwardness and inconvenience that has very long-term gains. The other thing that part of that conversation has to talk about is the fact that it's not about us. It's about our children and our children's children. So what kind of place do we want to build? Yeah, you're going to be inconvenienced because you're going to have to add 3 minutes to your travel time. But if that is the implication and the only trade-off that you're going to have for ensuring sustained property value for your kids and a better life in which they're going to be happier and healthier, I think it's a trade-off worth making. And those are the kind of conversations that need to be had. They're very frank. They're a little bit honest. They're a little bit uncomfortable. But I think they're important to have. And then I think there's a really important opportunity because people are really smart, especially young people, involving them in that conversation. They are well-traveled. Okay, you know, a lot is being said about millennials, okay? And some of it good, some of it bad, but they are a huge force of change right now. They're buying less cars. They're interested in shared stuff, sharing things. They're disruptive to the economy. I mean, they're the ones that are driving disruption and the change going on here. So, so we do need to involve them in that conversation, and they know what kind of city they want, and they get it, and that's why we're seeing significant growth in mixed-use areas and downtowns because they're driving a lot of that change because they're kind of smart about things. They don't want to drive, not because they're an anti-car, it's because their time is valuable. They'd rather pick a place to work and live, which is closer to work, because they don't want to spend 40, 50, 3 hours in a car or traveling. That's absurd when you can actually get into a bike and do it in 5 minutes or walk there. Most people are actually walking in the downtown because even transit isn't meeting expectations because we're so far behind in transit building. So I think that there's some hard conversations that need to be had, and we have to involve and make sure that includes everybody.
Yeah, I think that's actually good advice, and we have a planning development committee quite regularly where that is a common theme at our meetings about, are we planning for the population today, or are we planning for the population that is coming? And that's always there's a tension there on that. So let's tap into some of your worldly experience. So Mississauga is transforming. We're moving from a suburb to an urban area. You mentioned the growth plan is directing a future population. What have you seen in your travels, your work experience, that's really worked well maybe in a similar circumstance?
You know, I'm going to try and focus a little bit in that, responding that to things that are more local, because I think there are some wonderful examples. If you want to go to, you know, if you're well traveled and you can get yourself to places like, you know, Washington D.C., where there's an extraordinary precedent of what's going on in suburban areas in terms of urbanizing these urban areas. You know, I'd happy to talk to you after this presentation, and I can talk to you about some really great places to go if you want to go on a road trip, for example, in North America. So, but locally, I'm just going to point to some places that you may know or may want to visit. I'm going to start off with first thing I have to say is that in suburban contexts, the difficulty in change here is that we have two types of patterns. I'll break it down very simply here. There's two types of patterns that have very different responses to change. One is the grid or modified grid configuration. This is really, really important. Excuse me. Suburban areas, like and I think of Mississauga, I would say roughly mostly south of Dundas, is a what can we say, grid or modified grid layout. Anything north of that changes, and it becomes primarily an arterial road and collector road system that is where the road system is very much tied to the land use. So to change the land use or change the roads is very difficult because it's very rigid. But anything south of that where there's a grid and where a lot of the change that we're seeing in suburban areas is in areas of least resistance is where the grid is. Because the grid is a very malleable and a very accommodating road system for change. So that's why places like Vancouver, which are built on the grid, or Western cities in general, are having a far easier time at urbanizing their suburban areas. And they also maintain and continue to build laneways, which rear lanes are a really great way to kind of push all the ugly and yucky stuff out of the front of the block and into the back areas. And they can also, they're very malleable for different typologies and different uses that might be changing. So I think it's important for us to point out those differences. So the places that we're seeing in the GTA, where we're seeing a lot of change, excuse me, is where the grid is. Usually around commercial corridors, like where just plazas and other types of kind of developments have occurred through the 1950s. So we're seeing that there's mid-rise buildings now rising, or mixed-use buildings that are appearing on a lot of these corridors. The revisiting of the malls, which I know that Mississauga is actually looking at as a study. Well, we can look at a great example of that here in the GTA at Don Mills. Don Mills is one of the very first malls built. And it's a really good example of a precursor to what we might begin to see in our malls in Mississauga. Excuse me. Just getting over a cold, folks. But Don Mills, has anybody been to the shops of Don Mills? Show of hands. So what is maybe lacking there is a greater mix of uses. So the place is alive at night as much as it is during the day when the shops are open. But public space, and the way in which you can walk about and feel like you're almost in a village is a really good example of a redevelopment of a mall into something more appealing and more walkable and actually more integrated into the city. So that is another example. And the other is what we're seeing in kind of what we call transitioning. The other one is North York Centre, and which is in the Etobicoke Centre area, where there's transit that is helping to support an increase in density and a transformation of what were kind of strip plazas into mixed-use environments in which you can live, work, and play. And a lot of people are choosing to live in these places. North York Centre is one, Etobicoke Centre is the other. And then the other ones are like Square One, Scarborough Town Centre, which are large land holdings that are in process of transitioning into more urban environments with less resistance, less complexity, because they weren't pre-existing urban areas. A lot of them were just greenfields. If you want to look at some good examples locally of changes that are happening in greenfields that are really successful, one is Markham Centre, as an example where they're building a new model, a kind of town center, just like Mississauga is, but they didn't have the impediment of a big mall. So this is a very successful mall, Square One, and it's probably going to be here for a very long time. So we have to figure out a way in which we can integrate it. And there's some great examples across North America where that's happening. But it also has to be designed and integrated in such a way that if it is going to change and it actually isn't successful, it isn't going to become this big kind of black hole. There needs to be a plan in place that if the mall begins to fail, how can it be transitioned into something else? I think that's an important thing to think about. I just want to point out six points. Does anybody know where 6 Points in Etobicoke is? Because you'll see a lot of construction going on there. It's the intersection of Kipling, Dundas, and Bloor, thank you, where they all intersect. At the time, land was cheap, and building a highway interchange to deal with a 6 Point intersection was sensible in the 1950s and 60s. Today, we are taking down that interchange, and if you go there, you'll see now that it's completely down. And what's really interesting is an example of what I call urban repair in a suburban context, that if you were to rethink some of this kind of wise thinking of the past, you can actually, in what was just an interchange, put in an entirely new infilled city block system that is going to introduce mixed uses, a new municipal center, which was design competition. This was all done while I was director of the City of Toronto. of urban design in the City of Toronto. And so what Etobicoke is going to get is this new hub of activity and mixed uses within walking distance of a lot of neighborhoods, done on what was once an interchange. And I think we can think of many places across the GTA that might also do something like that.
So let's change it up a bit and see if anybody has a question or maybe even just a comment on the film that you've seen. Anyone? Yes.
Hey, thanks so much for your comments. I really appreciate that you had local context to consider. So in my experience coming to city consultations, I see two things. I see a lack of young people coming out, so I wonder what your thoughts are about how do we actually bring millennials out to consultations, which may be at times we're working, at times we're at school, stuff like that. And then just to comment on the fact that I see, particularly in social media, the highest management at the city, as well as our mayor and city councilors, they are very much promoting this extreme high density, promoting these really big luxury towers that are coming into our city center. They talk about it as great for the economy. It looks modern, it looks great, you know, the Exchange District, the M-City, and it doesn't seem to jive with what the public is demanding and what best practices like this documentary show. So how do we bridge that disconnect? You know, Councillor Demerla, who's new, is a rare exception to this. But if the majority is approving the policies at the top and disagreeing with the public, how do we address this? Because I'm not seeing that change happening. Thanks.
Okay, those are two very big, complex questions, and I'm going to try to. I want to get to the second one, which is a really important one. But the first one, which is about consultation, is that we have to. You have to be aware of what is of interest to the multiple generations that you want involved, and the multiple communities of interest that exist out there. So you have everything from the seniors down to the millennials and even maybe school children that might have something to say. And then you have a multicultural environment and demographic. And then you have areas of interest, whether it's those that are physically challenged to those that are interested in mobility or other types of kind of transit recycling. For example, the cycling community, for example, is a very important militant, in some cases, community. So there's so many different areas of interest, and it's very important that the consultation strategy be multi-pronged, offering a variety of different ways in which to reach people, that we can't just rely on open houses and those kind of traditional come to this meeting approaches, that we need to utilize the technology today, use social media, and use other interactive techniques out there that enable everybody to have an ability to participate. And recognizing that people participate in many different ways. Sometimes they like to participate in ways in which they roll up the sleeves and get right down to it and involved and have a lot to say on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, people with very busy lives but have a lot to say and a lot of strong opinions about things but just don't have the time. And so they maybe aren't able to be there proactively but are able to respond and be more reactive to a plan, for example. So we need to provide the kind of means or the medians by which we can collect that information as well. We can have a whole meeting about consultation. I've done a lot of it in my lifetime, and we can talk about many of the techniques that work and don't work. At the end of the day, if we promise to consult in a certain way, we have to deliver. So for example, we can't say that we're going to collect all of the social media outcomes and in fact do so without having a hired full-time person to do that, because it will take that much time sometimes. So I think we have to be realistic in terms of how we manage expectations around consultation. We'll put that aside for now. Second question, which is a really good one, is that part of the reaction to height here, or to the acceptance of height in the city centers, is a policy one. We've kind of given away the rights to say no to height in the downtown Mississauga area, because the policies are such that you don't have height restrictions. So it's very difficult to come to somebody who owns property here and say, you don't have height restrictions, but we're going to put one on you. So it becomes a challenge. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that the policy can't change. There will be implications and challenges to that. There might even be costs associated with that. We don't know for certain until it's done. But there's also incentives that the city can do to solicit behavior that it would prefer. So for example, worked in contexts in which there was a similar regime of no height, but parking was a very valuable tool to use to incentivize the behavior that we want. So for example, in Saskatoon, I was thinking about a plan that we did there. We had a neighborhood called Nutana, which was in fact where downtown Saskatoon started. It was a beautiful heritage neighborhood of houses, but there was a main street, and that main street had almost no height restrictions. So nobody really noticed or cared because the development growth in Saskatoon wasn't such that there was ever a threat of a tall building. But that's changed now. So suddenly people woke up and said, oh my God, we've got to do something about this. One of the proposals I made was that, well, we know that there's parking requirements associated with height, and the thing is, to deliver on that parking would mean you have to go very tall to build, really, to make a viable, deep, a multi-story, below-grade parking structure. But they don't want to do that. The development community was tied to, you have to provide this much parking to build this much density. But what if we were to take and reduce all of that parking in exchange for a smaller, more transitional, more appropriate fitting building? And the profit margins, just going big and taller doesn't necessarily mean more profit for developers, right? More profit for developers is keeping your costs low and selling high. And so it could be done in a smaller building. It's really just a mathematical thing. So I just want to give you that as an example, that how do we get buildings to be more tamed in the city center might be about incentives to do so. And so don't give away your parking requirements yet. Hold that in your back pocket to use as a negotiating tool.
I agree. We are holding that
Okay.
as one of our tools. So we are pretty much out of time, as I can see the 1 minute sign is up there. So I just wanted to thank you very much, Harold. This has been fantastic. I hope you enjoyed it. A round of applause for Harold.